Welcome back to the BNSF Marias Pass HO scale layout. If you remember from episode 1, we ripped up a bunch of track work here in what used to be the scene of Crawford, Nebraska. And the reason for that is we are completely scrapping the Crawford Hill scenery that used to populate the upper level of my layout, and we're turning it into the stretch of grade on Marias Pass between Essex and Marias Summit. To me, one of the most essential scenes along Marias Pass is Essex, Montana. And I thought that this scene here, the old scene of Crawford, Nebraska, would be the perfect spot for that. So I wanted to take this scenery here and basically turn it into this. There's a lot going on at Essex on the prototype, and I obviously could not incorporate all of that into the shelf that used to be Crawford, Nebraska. So I had to make some decisions about what to include. One of the bigger or most notable features at Essex is a little yard, and I initially thought maybe I wanted to incorporate some of those yard tracks, but to do that I would have had to compromise the wide swath of kind of just bare ballast and dirt at Essex, which to me is an important part of the look. So rather than compress the scene from front to back and try to include as many tracks as possible, I actually decided to exclude the yard altogether. But what I did keep was a yard lead on the far right-hand side of the scene that kind of swings off near the crossover there, but it doesn't go anywhere. It just falls off the edge of the layout. But it implies that there's more going on, basically where the aisleway is. In the middle of the scene, on the far side of the main line, I also incorporated another prototype feature, and that is a short little auxiliary siding, which from photos seems to be often used to stage ballast trains or other maintenance of way equipment. Now, oftentimes the prototype photos that you see taken at Essex are from this perspective, and they're usually from this elevated vantage point, either on a pedestrian bridge or on the ramp up to the pedestrian bridge. And that's another feature that I want to incorporate into this scene. So even though it is, at this moment as I record this, the pedestrian bridge has not been built, I do have the ramp and the foundation for it in place. And so you'll see that the photos that I'm taking now in the layout's current state are not too far from the perspective that you see here on the prototype. So one feature that is not entirely prototypical in terms of its location is the crossover on the west end or right-hand side of this scene. There actually was already a crossover here in the scene of Crawford, and I actually decided to keep it for the scene of Essex because at prototype Essex, there is a crossover on the west end. It just happens to be around a curve and a little bit further down grade. On my layout, the crossover is actually not a crossover at all in terms of between two main lines. It's actually just one end of the siding at Essex. What appears to be two main tracks is actually a single main line, and that second track that heads under the overpass and into the staging room just dead ends as a tail track back there. But nonetheless, I thought this was a feature that, even though it is a bit compressed and it's brought into the scene of Essex proper, it's still prototypical in terms of its appearance. And so the scene of Essex, depending on which end you're looking at it from, will appear to be two different locations on the prototype. So anyway, that kind of explains the rationale behind why I ripped up a lot of the track work here in Crawford. But as you can see, I was actually able to salvage a fair bit of it. Namely, the main line remains mostly unchanged, and that crossover that was there is also pretty much unchanged. So just a few track additions and splicing to do. And once I got the tracks in place, I of course had to drop some feeders so I could hook up all of the new sections of track to the power buses. So one of the last tasks of track work that I had to do was finish up the engine facility. And this is something that I put off for a long time because it was not something I was looking forward to. And there are just 4 short tracks, 3 of which extend out of the engine facility, that needed to be installed. So to do this, and this is the same methodology that I used for the scene of Essex that we just took a look at. I cut the track pieces with some cutting pliers and then used a needle file to basically clean up any extra metal flash or rough edges so that the rail joiners would slide over the rail. I had to extend the cork here a little bit. I needed to add an 1/8 inch worth of cork, but it was kind of curling up on me, so I put down some plastic and then a wooden board on top of that and weighted it down and let that dry. And then I was easily able to peel that all back. And one of the interesting things that I did for the track work here that I didn't employ anywhere else on the layout was I installed feeders to the track before putting the track down. And the only reason for that is this is a really inaccessible corner, so it was much easier to solder the feeders on while the track was in front of me rather than tucked away in this corner. Now, as I'm getting the turnouts installed, one of the other things I'm doing is working on final track work repairs. One of those things is working on sidewinders. So what I've done is I've turned up the heat in the layout room. It's also winter, so humidity's low, and that's also a problem. But when you get a bunch of operators in here, the heat turns up, and I want to avoid having these sort of sidewinder problems later on. So once it turns summer, it actually gets kind of cooler in the basement, and also humidity is a bit higher, so things tend to expand, and this becomes less of an issue. So I'm trying to make some repairs to track work so that the joints are flush right now, and that if they pull apart a little bit when things expand, it's not a big deal. But right now I've identified a few spots where things are a bit too tight, and I'm fixing those before getting the turnouts powered on. And then we should be good to go. Here's another one. This one's interesting because it's not really so much a sidewinder as when the heat increases and things expand. This is one of those joints that actually likes to push up. So I've disconnected the rail joiners, but I came over here and this joint in the track was at a peak. It had sort of pushed up to a point, which we obviously can't have. The complex of turnouts on the east end of Whitefish were also a trouble spot. This was actually some of the first track work I laid way back in late 2014 or early 2015. So I just completely ripped this out and started from scratch, and now it's much, much smoother. So here in the scene of Columbia Falls on the lower level, the actual nameplate and location does not change because I was already modeling Columbia Falls down here. But I did want to make the track arrangement a bit more prototypical, so I removed the original industry layout here in this scene. So looking at, once again, another aerial photograph and then a current version of my layout's track plan, you can see some of the similarities between the prototype and the track arrangement at Columbia Falls. So the focus of this scene is the Weyerhaeuser medium density fiberboard plant. And whereas before I had just sort of a jumble of spaghetti tracks here in multiple industries, we're really focusing on the single industry that has just one track that heads to the main building complex. But in addition to that single track, you'll also see there's a runaround track sort of off of the siding there. That doubles as an interchange track. And the reason that that's an interchange track is because the track, if you follow it to the left of the scene, that one that goes into the backdrop there, that is supposed to simulate the Kalispell subdivision. which used to be owned and operated by the Mission Mountain Railroad. So that line there, even though on my layout it just stub ends into the backdrop, on the real thing that continues south to Kalispell, Montana, where there are a number of other industries and a new industrial park. And that line, which you can see on the prototype photo, swinging off on the left-hand side of that photo, kind of near the stacks of lumber there, or the logs, I should say. That used to be owned and operated by the Mission Mountain Railroad until 2020 when BNSF took the line back. But on my layout, we're pretending that it still is owned by the Mission Mountain Railroad. And the advantage of that is then the little track just in front of the Weyerhaeuser building there, that runaround track, we're using that operationally as an interchange track. So not only will the Columbia Falls local bring box cars to the Weyerhaeuser MDF plant and then pick them up, it'll also bring other cars like gondolas and empty and loaded center beam flat cars, and those will get spotted on that interchange track there. Now, one of the other repairs I have is this interchange track that we have next to, got our main line, our siding here. Here's our interchange track, and then to the left is the industry track that'll go to our Weyerhaeuser medium density fiberboard warehouse that'll eventually tower over in the corner there. But if you look, and it might be hard to see, but as these guys roll onto this track, the boxcars really tip to the left, right about, it's hard to see, but they're really leaning to the left. I've already put a few shims under the track to straighten it out, but the problem is I came in at some later point after laying the main cork road bed, and I put this 1/8 inch sheet of basically what's end scale cork bed or cork road bed down, but a lot of it kind of like lipped up along the edge of the main cork, and that causes the tracks to sort of lean to the left the way they sit on here. So what I'm doing is right now it's just kind of loose, and I've been installing, I think I've got one here. I've been installing little styrene shims like this, and what I'll do then is just put a bead of glue along the edge and kind of press into that, and that should make things sit nice and flush. So you'll see more of that right here. So let me put more of these in, we'll glue it, and then see how the cars sit. Now, as you can imagine, rearranging the tracks here at Columbia Falls was a fair bit of work, and there was some tweaking involved. So once I was done getting everything situated the way I wanted it to be, there was of course only one thing to do, and that is run trains.
Well, that's it for this video, but if you want to see more content just like it, I politely ask you to like, subscribe, and turn on the notifications so that you don't miss my next video. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.